They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists.
They can go back and they can cross and open the border both ways.
Open borders? No, that's a Koch brothers proposal.
It's lying to the population about the effects of immigration, as you know.
From 1776 to 1924, the United States had what we would call today open borders. This means the total free movement of people from one country to another without any sort of legal restrictions. During this time period, there were 4 major waves of voluntary immigration: the Germans, the Irish, the Chinese, and the Italians. And each of these waves shared a few things in common. They all began work in what was considered the lowest skilled labor at the time of their arrival. After 2 to 3 generations, they were able to achieve assimilation and establish careers in higher skilled work or even political positions. Lastly, they were all met with intense hostility from the native-born population. At this time, native-born Americans feared that immigrants would change American culture for the worse, impose their foreign religions on them, and most of all, they feared that they would steal their jobs. Sounds familiar. Regardless of these fears, we all know the United States saw tremendous benefits from each of these major immigration waves. As immigrants fled persecution, famine, or poverty, they simultaneously filled an important and necessary role in the American workforce. This is where it gets interesting. Decades after the Immigration Act of 1924, which ended open borders in the US, the government would once again require the help of immigrants. In 1942, during the height of the Second World War, the US needed immigrant labor so much that they implemented what was called the bracero program. The bracero program was an agreement between the US and Mexico, where the US offered millions of agricultural labor contracts to Mexican farm workers, in which they were temporarily provided free housing, insurance, and a minimum wage, among other benefits. This program became so incredibly successful in the Southwest that it stayed in effect long after the war, not ending until nearly 2 decades later. This program helped both the Mexican laborers as well as the American farmers in a sort of symbiotic relationship. Immigrants have historically done amazing things for this country and have objectively led to our success as a nation, and it's really a shame that Americans have managed to treat first-generation immigrants like second-class citizens every single time. Which has led up to this point where we've established some pretty inhumane ways in order to limit immigration. Today, if you are an undocumented immigrant in the United States, you risk being separated from your children, being detained, and potentially losing your life through the impossible treks through the desert if you choose to actually cross the border. With all these terrifying consequences, why even make that risk? The answer is that many immigrants today are facing those same issues of persecution, violence, poverty, and corrupt governments that the immigrants prior to 1924 faced. Their hopeless situation forces them to leave families and their old lives in hope for a better future for themselves and their children. But why do they feel the need to come illegally? First of all, the majority of undocumented immigrants came here legally but are overstaying their visas. But for those who do actually come illegally, to put it simply, the process takes way too long. These are oftentimes extremely desperate people who don't have over a decade to wait. Today, a visa can take anywhere from a couple weeks to 6 months to get approved. In order to be granted citizenship, you have to live here for at least 5 years, and many of these visas or guest work programs only last about 3 years. So you will need to apply for a green card, which can take anywhere from 7 months to 3 years if you can even get that approved. And after that, you can apply for a citizenship, which would take another 6 to 8 months on average just to hear back. People in dire situations do not have that much time to wait. Not to mention, regardless of their skill level, they are often poor people who can't afford the costs of all these massive forms or the lawyer fees that come with explaining the overly complicated legal terminology. But if you don't have sympathy for people who are looking to escape factors that they've had zero control over, then what I've just said doesn't mean a whole lot to you. Understandably, you want to know how open borders will affect you. We've all heard this idea that immigrants are bringing crime, or maybe they'll ruin American culture, but above all else, they'll be bad for the economy and American jobs. And these would all be completely valid fears if any of them were proven to be true. Before we get any further, I want you to understand why the topic of open borders is so intriguing to me. Neither political party seems to have a unified stance on this issue. While conservatives seem to push this narrative that Democrats are constantly advocating for open borders, most Democrats are in favor of a pathway to amnesty, but the truth is that few are actually in favor of open borders.
Open borders?
Open
borders. That's a Koch brothers proposal. The
Really?
idea, of course, I mean, that's a right-wing proposal.
And some have even gone as far as to advocate for physical forms of border security in the past.
Folks, I voted for a fence. I voted unlike most Democrats, and some of you won't like it. I voted for 700-mile fence. And let me tell you something, folks. People are driving across that border with tons, hear me, tons of everything from byproducts from methamphetamine to cocaine to heroin. It's all coming up through corrupt Mexico.
And while the vast majority of conservatives are in support of strict border security, traditional libertarians are actually the biggest proponents of open borders.
If they're living here, I don't want to see a whole thing of 6- and 8-year-old kids being made, one totally uneducated and made to feel that they're living with outside the law. Let's address ourselves to the fundamentals. These are good people, strong people. Part of my family is a Mexican. Rather than making them or talking about putting up a fence, why don't we work out some recognition of our mutual problems, make it possible for them to come here legally with a work permit, and then while they're working and earning here, they pay taxes here. And when they want to go back, they can go back and they can cross and open the border both ways by understanding their problems. This is the only safety valve right now they have with that unemployment that probably keeps the lid from blowing off down there. And I think we could have a fine relationship, and it would solve the problem you mentioned also.
Personally, I believe that it's in the United States' best interest to not put limitations or restrictions on the amount of people that are let in. The only people that should not be let in are those who would be considered an immediate potential threat to American lives. Hopefully by the end of the video, you can understand why I've come to this conclusion. So now let's get into the counterpoints. When discussing immigration, most people first bring up this idea that immigrants are bringing crime into the US. This is an inherently racist concept when you realize that immigrants, both legal and illegal, are both less likely to commit crime per capita than native-born citizens. Throughout this whole researching process, I scoured through dozens of conservative videos to make sure I understood the other side, and I came across one by Tucker Carlson that is particularly interesting. In it, he brings up this insane statistic.
So I know stories, but I'm looking for facts, and I think it's fair to ask for facts. So John Lott, who's a researcher, a social scientist, got a hold of the conviction numbers, which the government of the state of Arizona has hidden from the population because it's lying to the population about the effects of immigration, as you know. And he found that illegal immigrants in the state of Arizona were more than twice as likely to commit murder and overall far more likely to commit crimes of all kinds, not immigration crimes, but violent and property crimes. So given that, those are facts. How can you reassure the residents, the legal residents of Arizona of all backgrounds, that this is good for them? I don't understand.
I was shocked when I heard this and had to look into the source that he used for myself. And upon a quick Google search, I found pages and pages of articles about how John Lott, the researcher he mentions, made a mistake of assuming a group of people who had been detained were undocumented immigrants, but there is in fact no way of knowing if this group was undocumented or not. And even if you wanted to know the actual number, it would be impossible based on the data that Lott was presented with.
Because it's lying to the population about the effects of immigration, as you know. Lying to the population about the effects of immigration.
Lying to the population.
The most understandable fear, in my opinion, is that if we were to open the borders, then a flood of low-skilled workers would come in and create increased competition for low-skilled jobs with native-born citizens. What most people in support of open borders bring up is this idea of the lump of labor fallacy. The lump of labor fallacy is an economic principle that states labor is not a fixed value, and when more people enter a workforce, this creates a change in demand, which must ultimately create a change in supply, which would require more labor. So in theory, more people equals more jobs. Well, this makes sense. I think that an important factor that it doesn't account for is the difference in labor skill level. Let me explain. I think most of us have this idea that immigrants coming into this country are all low-skilled laborers who will create more competition for other low-skilled jobs. When searching this up, I found many sources which display this idea of a bottleneck graph. Immigrants tend to be either very low-skilled or very high-skilled laborers, while the typical native workforce tends to be middle-skilled workers. So if you add in those immigrants, the graph is filled and the workforce is evened out, maximizing the GDP. I wanted to see if this concept was actually how the US immigrant relationship works, and it's really not. In the past decade, the US has seen a massive growing need for middle-skilled jobs. Shoot. Well, let's look at it the other way. If immigrants lead to strict job competition, we would probably see a rise in unemployment whenever we see a rise in immigration. I looked into it and this is not at all the case. There is almost no correlation at all, and after economic disasters, we actually see lower rates of immigration that follow. And it's so obvious that, of course, someone who is in an economic disaster themselves really doesn't care to leave their whole life behind just to enter another country in economic distress. While this supports the fact that immigration doesn't have a correlation to unemployment trends, it still doesn't help the fact that a rise in immigration might lead to a rise in low-skilled workers, which is something that the US doesn't have an immediate need for right now. But this is a pretty big assumption that all the immigrants coming into the US are all poor, low-skilled workers. Looking further into it, in the past few decades, less and less immigrants are part of this low-skilled worker tier and are shifting more towards middle and high-skilled labor. Think about it, if you live in a country that's struggling economically, why would you leave your whole life behind to immigrate to a country that doesn't even offer immediate opportunities for you? The counter to this is that people might not come for the job opportunities, but they sure are coming for that sweet welfare and public benefits that Americans get, right? Not really. Undocumented immigrants are ineligible for any of these programs because of their status, and legal immigrants are less likely to take advantage of these benefits per capita than native-born citizens. And yes, this takes into account economic and age-eligible people, which means that immigrants, for whatever reason, are not even accepting these benefits that they're offered. There's also this notion that undocumented immigrants are here taking advantage of the benefits of the US and not paying taxes. But the truth is that 50 to 75% of undocumented immigrants pay taxes, and right now they pay $11.64 billion in state and local taxes every year. If these undocumented immigrants became legal, we would likely see that number go up by another 2.1 billion. The final point I hear brought up a lot, and one that I consider to be a completely meaningless point, but one that I have to address, is that immigrants simply will not assimilate. Now, I thought about bringing up various studies that I found from a quick search that supports the fact that assimilation is achieved after 2 to 3 generations living in the US, but I decided not to actually list any of these studies for the following reason. All 4 of my grandparents were born in Mexico, and all 4 of them had a grasp of the English language when they got here. My mom grew up speaking Spanish as her first language, but also just being in public schools became more well-educated in English than Spanish. While Spanish was my older sister's first language as well, they would eventually just begin to speak English at home. I grew up having Mexican food, but also Italian food, also Chinese food, Mediterranean food, etc. And if you take a minute to reflect on your day, you will start to recognize so many things that you take for granted that originate from other parts of the world. My point is that American culture isn't just one thing. It's never been. It's this collage of cultures that makes America unlike any other country in the world. And this idea of assimilation being that you can only speak English in front of other Americans, or that you can't freely practice your religion without judgment, or whatever it is so silly to me. While looking at all these different sources on how long it takes on average to reach assimilation, I was finding so many different parameters for these studies because they all defined assimilation a little bit differently. I feel like that reveals a lot about why this point is so meaningless. Growing up, American culture to me was about embracing diversity and the different backgrounds that come with it. And I believe America would be a better place if we all truly felt and acted like that. Thanks. Looking further into it,